Imagine standing in a dense, humid jungle. You are 3.5 feet tall, your brain is the size of an orange, and you weigh 60 pounds. You have massive, flat feet, meaning you physically cannot sprint, and you look up. Looming over you is a 6-foot-tall carnivorous stork. Its beak is as thick as a human forearm, built to crush bone. Hidden in the tall grass are 10-foot-long venomous lizards, and scurrying around your ankles are rats the size of medium dogs. This is not fantasy. This was daily reality on the Indonesian island of Flores 50,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years, a distinct species of human fought a desperate war for survival in a confined biological meat grinder. Scientists call them Homo floresiensis. The media called them Hobbits. Their existence permanently shattered the established timeline of human evolution. Their daily life was a relentless survival horror. In September 2003, an archaeological team was excavating a massive limestone cave in Liang Bua. The cave stretched 130 feet wide, vaulting like a prehistoric cathedral. The researchers were simply looking for evidence of modern humans passing through Indonesia. Digging 20 feet below the cave floor, their trowels scraped against an unmineralized skeleton encased in wet clay. The skull had the crumbling consistency of mashed potatoes. The researchers had to apply chemical hardeners just to lift it without it completely disintegrating. And at first glance, they assumed they had found a human child. But as the mud was cleared away, a grim reality set in. The teeth were heavily worn down from decades of chewing abrasive foods. The permanent molars were completely erupted. The skull sutures were fully fused. This was not a child. This was a 30-year-old adult female. She stood roughly 3 feet 6 inches tall. The true shock came when anthropologists measured her brain case. It had a volume of 426 cubic centimeters. A modern human brain is about 1,300 cubic centimeters. Her brain was exactly the size of a modern chimpanzee's. Yet, scattered around her remains were hundreds of sophisticated stone tools, sharp flakes, points, and perforators made from volcanic rock. This broke the absolute core rule of our evolutionary tree. For a century, anthropologists believed advanced tool-making required a massive, complex brain. Large brain equals advanced behavior. Homo floresiensis shattered this. The scientific community erupted in disbelief. Leading scientists published aggressive papers claiming the skeleton was a modern Homo sapien suffering from a growth-stunting disease like microcephaly. The debate was vicious. It took years of meticulous 3D scanning to prove the skull lacked any deformities associated with human disease. But the definitive proof came from her wrists. In a modern human, wrist bones are shaped like a boot, acting as a shock absorber. It allows our thumbs to handle the kinetic force of striking stone against stone. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens both have this shape. The Flores wrist was completely different. Her trapezoid bone was a primitive pyramid, lacking any modern shock-absorbing structure. Her wrist was anatomically identical to Australopithecus, an ancient hominin that lived in Africa over 3 million years ago. Her shoulders shrugged forward, positioned close to her ears. Her arms were disproportionately long, hanging nearly down to her knees like a climbing ape. Her legs were incredibly short. Her massive feet were 70% the length of her height, completely lacking a longitudinal arch. She walked flat-footed, requiring her to bend her knees significantly just to march through the jungle. This bizarre anatomy was the result of millions of years of distinct, isolated evolution. Flores is located in Wallacea, surrounded by deep, treacherous oceanic trenches. Even during the absolute height of the ice ages, when global sea levels dropped by 400 feet, Flores was never connected to the Asian mainland. It remained an isolated fortress, accessible only by violent tsunamis or accidental rafting on uprooted trees. When animals get trapped on an isolated island, biology enforces a brutal phenomenon known as the island rule. Small animals, freed from mainland predators, grow to massive sizes. Giant rats scurried across the cave floors of Liang Bua. But large animals, facing extreme starvation due to limited caloric resources, are forced to rapidly shrink. A population of ancient mainland elephants called stegodon somehow washed ashore. Over generations, the island squeezed them. The stegodons evolved into bizarre dwarfs weighing just 800 pounds, the size of a modern cow, yet retaining massive, curving tusks. Without large mammalian carnivores like tigers or wolves, massive reptiles took over the apex positions. Komodo dragons ruled the island. These 10-foot-long monitor lizards possessed serrated teeth and venom glands, inducing massive blood loss. They hunted the dwarf elephants. Sharing the skies and the ground with the dragons was Leptoptelos robustus, a giant predatory marabou stork. Standing 6 feet tall, it had heavily muscled leg bones adapted for high-speed sprinting and a heavy-duty beak designed to spear large prey. Into this freakish, inverted food chain stepped an ancient human. Current evidence suggests their ancestors made landfall at least 1 million years ago, and once trapped, the island went to work on them. The human brain is a relentless energy drain. In modern humans, it consumes 20% of daily calories despite making up 2% of body weight. On an island where starvation is the default state, a massive brain is a death sentence. Natural selection aggressively favored smaller bodies and drastically reduced brain sizes. The ancestors of Homo floresiensis shrank to 3 feet tall. Their brains regressed to the size of an ape's. Yet they did not lose their intelligence. They adapted it. The inside of the Hobbit skull reveals that the frontal lobe responsible for problem solving was highly convoluted. The temporal lobes were expanded. They had drastically less raw computing power, but their neurological hardware was violently optimized for pure survival. And they needed it. Homo floresiensis actively hunted the dwarf elephants. Deep inside Liang Bua, archaeologists found stegodon bones covered in deep, deliberate cut marks from systematic butchering. Taking down an 800-pound animal with primitive stone flakes requires highly coordinated pack hunting. It requires communication, trap setting, and tactical execution. A species with the brain volume of a chimpanzee was organizing complex ambushes. They would have needed to violently defend their kills from swarms of Komodo dragons and giant sprinting birds. To physically butcher an animal 10 times their size without advanced blades, the Hobbits used bipolar flaking. They placed a volcanic stone on a hard anvil rock and struck it vertically from above. This crushed the core rock, producing razor-thin microblades perfectly suited for slicing thick stegodon hide. Because their shrugged, more primitive shoulders prevented them from throwing projectiles with high velocity, they could not hunt from a safe distance. Every kill would have required close quarters combat. Every meal required standing toe-to-toe with an elephant and bleeding it out using a shard of a glass-sharp rock. For a long time, researchers assumed Homo floresiensis was a dwarfed version of Homo erectus, the first human species universally known to leave Africa. The theory was that Homo erectus swept into Asia, got stranded on Flores, and simply shrank. But groundbreaking discoveries threw a massive wrench into this clean timeline. In 2014, 50 miles east of Liang Bua, paleontologists discovered more hominin fossils, including a lower jaw fragment and teeth. The dating was staggering. They were 700,000 years old. The reality was even more shocking. These fossils were even smaller than the Liang Bua Hobbit. The ancestors of Homo floresiensis had already achieved extreme dwarfism nearly 1 million years ago. Furthermore, the teeth showed highly primitive features pointing much further back in time, sharing distinct traits with Homo habilis, or Australopithecus. This implies that Homo erectus might not have been the first human to leave Africa. A much smaller, highly ape-like hominin might have made the impossible journey across the Middle East, through the dense jungles of Asia, and down into the Indonesian archipelago over 2 million years ago. They crossed violent oceans without boats and survived apex predators without advanced weapons. By the time specific Homo floresiensis individuals were living in Liang Bua cave 50,000 years ago, they were the ultimate battle-tested survivors. They mastered their bizarre environment. They knew where to source volcanic rocks and track the migration patterns of dwarf elephants. The density of bone fragments indicates they lived there consistently for thousands of generations. But then, the timeline abruptly stops. Around 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record for Homo floresiensis goes dark. The dwarf elephants vanish, the giant predatory stork disappear, the sophisticated stone tools completely cease. The hobbits seem to have been erased from the earth. For years, scientists pointed to a massive volcanic eruption, noting a thick layer of ash directly above the last known hobbit remains. The hypothesis was that a catastrophic eruption blanketed the island in toxic ash, wiping out the entire ecosystem in a single apocalyptic event. But precise dating of the sediment layers tells a much darker, much more violent story. The dates of their sudden extinction align perfectly with an invasive species entering the archipelago. 50,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens were pushing rapidly through Southeast Asia. They were moving out of Africa, hopping islands on their relentless way to colonize Australia. They were tall, they were armored with projectile weapons like bows and spear throwers, and they possessed massive, endlessly hungry brains. Earlier assumptions claimed Homo floresiensis used fire based on charred bones found in the cave. However, rigorous dating techniques overturned this. The fire pits actually belonged to modern humans who occupied the cave thousands of years later. The hobbits survived, hunted, and butchered elephants entirely without fire. They ate raw meat. They survived pitch-black jungle nights without a single flame to keep massive predators at bay, making their survival for hundreds of thousands of years even more structurally terrifying. When modern humans landed on Flores, they brought an unprecedented level of predatory efficiency. Homo floresiensis, optimized for a closed island loop, was suddenly forced to compete for the exact resources against an apex predator that adapted behavior faster than any biological rule. Now, there's no direct archaeological evidence of physical battle. No hobbit skull has ever been found with a modern human spear point in it. But circumstantial evidence is completely deafening. Everywhere Homo sapiens went during their global expansion, native megafauna and archaic human species died out. Neanderthals in Europe were wiped out, Denisovans in Asia vanished, the giant sloths in the America were hunted to extinction, and the hobbits on Flores disappeared the exact moment we arrived. Homo sapiens did not need to hunt the hobbits to kill them, though. They just had to outcompete them. Overhunt the dwarf elephants until herds collapsed, dominate fresh water sources, monopolize the best caves, and in a tightly restricted ecosystem, taking the food is exactly the same as taking a life. It is entirely possible that for a brief and violent window of time, two completely different species of humans stared at each other across the dark Flores jungle. One stood 6 feet tall, armed with advanced composite weapons, fire, and complex language, and the other stood 3 feet tall, flat-footed, a living ghost from the deepest roots of the human family tree. Interestingly, local Flores folklore speaks of creatures called Ebu Gogo. In the native language, Ebu Gogo translates to the grandmother who eats anything. Locals describe them as small, hairy, cave-dwelling people who walked awkwardly and communicated in murmurs. According to legends, locals hunted the Ebu Gogo down, trapping them in caves and suffocating them with smoke. The legends explicitly state that the Ebu Gogo did not know how to make fire and ate food completely raw, perfectly mirroring recent discoveries that stripped fire control away from the Hobbits. While science strictly relies on fossils, the chilling overlap between the ancient cultural memory and the physical reality is impossible to ignore. A tribe of pre-industrial farmers accurately described the skeletal structure, the lack of a chin, the short stature, and long arms of a hominin species modern paleontology only discovered using CT scans and carbon dating. They discovered a creature that matched LB1 down to the biomechanics of its walk. The reality of Homo floresiensis is not a cute fairy tale about little people in a magical jungle. It is a harsh, mechanical demonstration of extreme evolutionary pressure. Biology does not care about human ego. If the harsh environment demands you to shrink to survive, you shrink. If the ecosystem demands your brain to revert to the size of an ape's, it reverts. Homo floresiensis endured hundreds of thousands of years of terrifying predatory storks, massive venomous dragons, and constant starvation. They adapted, they fought, and they survived it all, only to be wiped out the exact moment they encountered us. And hey, I'll catch you next time.